May it please the court. It is such an honor to be with each and every one of you. I'm so inspired to be with the heroic people in this room. Each and every one of you deserve this beautiful award, and so we are so humbled to be here accepting this honor. In the great Jubilee year of 2000, Pope St. John Paul II issued an apostolic letter. I didn't realize this until recently when the relics of St. Thomas More were touring the United States, but I looked it up and I found out that in 2000, John Paul II issued this apostolic letter and he proclaimed St. Thomas More to be, quote, the heavenly patron of statesmen and politicians. Imagine that. Politicians have a patron saint. Now, no offense, Representative Lyons. There are many, many exceptions, and he is a hero of Thomas More proportions. But if this, and yes, let's give him a hand. But if having a patron saint of politicians seems like a contradiction, it's because politics have largely become, sadly, unmoored from its proper goal of seeking both the good of the human person as well as the common good. So in his letter proclaiming Thomas More as the patron saint of politicians, this Pope from Poland, who had personally experienced great suffering under Nazi and communist regimes, recognized the ideal that a political system should have, in the words of John Paul II, as its supreme goal, the service of the human person. And that, of course, is the goal of the natural law that Nick spoke about in our earlier presentation and that he will briefly address again in his remarks tonight. So as lawyers, we have dedicated our careers to advocating for the dignity of the human person in the field of bioethics. And Nick and I asked both Pope St. John Paul II and Thomas More for their intercession. But to be clear, even though Thomas More has been proclaimed the patron saint of politicians, Bioethics Defense Fund is not a political organization. We do not engage in election politics. We do not support or oppose candidates or even pieces of legislation. Rather, Bioethics Defense Fund is a nonprofit, legal, and educational organization. We use our experience in giving legal consultation to politicians, like Representative Lyons, and to legislators around the states, in parliaments around the world, and to attorneys general who are litigating these cases in court. We look at the culture of death and the fallout, and we think of creative and strategic ways to write model legislation that educates across the political spectrum. For example, one of the pieces of model legislation that we wrote and had enacted in my backyard of Louisiana was to make abortion clinics into points of rescue for sex trafficking victims. By reaching out to young people who are so concerned about trafficking victims and then tying together that dirty business with traffickers who bring these girls into abortion clinics to have abortions and then throw them out to the street, we tie together two industries that prey on young women, right? Another example is to tie the popular bipartisan issue of disability discrimination to abortion by debating in law schools or writing amicus briefs to the Supreme Court on disability discrimination that happens in the process of prenatal diagnosis. With the Americans with Disabilities Act, we recognize people with disabilities as being full members of society. But if we detect that you have a disability before you're born, how much respect will you receive then? Not very much. And so by connecting these issues, we find a way forward. We've been honored to work with influential policymakers around the nation and abroad as consultants, and then to put that on-the-ground experience in the service of our larger mission of education of the new and current generation of lawyers, doctors, and policymakers. We even create these cutting-edge presentations for everyday citizens that are in church parishes or in civics groups. When Nick and I co-founded Bioethics Defense Fund in 2005, it was in response to Pope St. John Paul II's challenge to, in his words, defend life with maximum determination. So following the lead of his beautiful writings, we adopted the following rubric that we find is often a winning way to discuss these issues of bioethics. And so this kind of ties into what Bob was pointing out. How do you raise a conversation that's in a winning way, right? That's how do you change hearts and minds with winning arguments? And bioethics, which seems like something difficult to discuss, is really medical ethics. And so I'm so excited to hear about the collaboration between the doctors and the lawyers here. Because look, think of all these issues. All of the bioethics issues deal with law and morality in medicine. It's medical ethics. Abortion involves a doctor. Human cloning and stem cell research, doctors and scientists. End-of-life decision-making, doctors, right? Healthcare rights of conscience. So doctors and lawyers need to be regaining this respect for human life. So here's the underlying rubric that's consistent with the anthropology that respects natural law and respects the dignity of the human person. So when these topics come up, or you see something on the news, or you want to raise a conversation about a particular practice, whether it's abortion or some weird new, cybrids or hybrids or three-parent embryos, and it seems like, how do we rethink all of these complicated issues? Here's what it comes down to. This is what it boils down to. Does the practice recognize the human being as a person who is made to love and be loved, or does the practice commodify the human being and treat them as an object to use and be used? Real simple. Love and be loved, use and be used. Culture of life, culture of death, right? That's what it comes down to. What more winning way to discuss something to say, I just believe because as a Christian we are made in the image of God, and God is a loving union, that we need to treat other human beings who are made in the image of God as persons to love and be loved. And it seems to me like this practice is making people into commodities to use and be used. Doesn't that seem wrong? It's a simple way to put it. So based on this rubric, we've sought to break through this binary approach of pro-choice versus pro-life, woman versus baby, science versus the church, and instead to forge and encourage a middle way where our nation's laws and policies embody what John Paul II called the law of the gift, that human beings find fulfillment in a sincere gift of themselves to one another, rather than by asserting themselves over another. But you may be wondering, how did this New Orleans girl end up consulting with influential people in the halls of power around the nation and the world? So I want to close with a brief telling of my story, not to acclaim myself, because there's not much to tell, but to give thanks to the Lord for what he has done in my life. So it began when I was, and this sounds like it'll be a long story because it starts when I'm 10 years old, but I'm at the feet of my Sicilian immigrant grandmother. And as she's taking out her bun and the long hair, and she's brushing out her hair, she tells me a story about how she went to the doctor, my grandmother with a 4th grade education, and the doctor told her, who at the time had 7 children, that she had a tumor and that he could remove that tumor. Well, my little grandmother, who stood all of, 4'10", looked that doctor in the face and said, "That's not a tumor, and you're not going to remove anything. I know life when I feel it. This is my child." Now, my mother tends to agree with the doctor that my father was a tumor, but he's working his way through that. But what she taught me at age 10 was that you didn't have to have a PhD or a law degree to speak up for life. And thank God that Amelia Maltese Chapetta spoke up for life, because if not, her number 8 child wouldn't be there and I wouldn't be here, right? So one woman speaking the truth makes a difference. And so to hurry my story along, I'm in law school, and as every educated young woman in the 80s would believe, I was personally pro-life, but believed that a woman should have the right to choose, right? That's what every reasonable person thinks. And I began clerking as the law clerk for the Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court. And I was praying at that time that no abortion cases would come to the court, because I knew that I was pro-life, but I was ashamed of it and didn't want to have to tell anybody about it because they might think poorly of me. Then a friend of mine shared with me about an abortion that she had had 10 years earlier. This is one of my best friends. And she told me about how the abortionists had punctured her uterus during the abortion, and she had nearly bled to death that night. They had sent her home not knowing what they had done, because of course you're bleeding. And if her sister were not there, realizing that she's writhing in pain and needed to go to the emergency room, she could have lost her life. She had high-risk pregnancies, to the point that where she could no longer have children because it was such a risk to her life. So at this point I realized that abortion just doesn't take the life of a unique and unrepeatable human being. Abortion hurts women, And I was in my mid-20s at this point. And when a Sicilian finds out that somebody's hurt their friends, somebody's gonna pay, right? Am I right? Okay, but here's the problem. I'm pro-life, so I can't kill anybody, right? So I think to myself, what am I gonna do? Wait a minute, I've got a law degree. I can use this, right? And so I started writing letters to the editor and writing letters to national pro-life law groups, asking them to take me in. And a long story occurs, and I tell the story in a book called Magnificat Proclaims, and I'm going to put that up on the website if you're interested. But it comes down to that I finally got over the anger, and through prayer began to see and be schooled in the idea that was new at the time, 22 years ago, that we need a pro-woman, pro-life message, just as Ruth was talking about. Abortion is not health care. Abortion hurts women, right? It kills unborn human beings. It hurts women medically and psychologically, and it robs men of their vocation to protect and to provide across the board. Now, we have finally come to a point where it's not women versus baby. We've got the pro-woman, pro-life thing down pretty much. I think a missing piece of the puzzle is for us to invite men back into the picture and say, hey, why isn't anybody talking about men who are casually exploiting women and then giving them the choice and $300 and leaving them off on their own, right? So it's time for us to reincorporate the mission of men in the cause for life. Don't let them, men, tell you that you have no voice because this is a woman's issue. This is a human rights issue, right? And so I want to close with a story about how when Nick first hired me, we were working for a Chicago-based public interest law firm. Nick was the general counsel. I was working in Louisiana with Louisiana Right to Life, and we were very successful in passing a lot of innovative pro-life laws. And he wanted me to come and join this national group and serve as national legislative consultant. And we worked out a deal to where I could stay in New Orleans and work remotely, because there was this new thing, it was called the internet, right? And when we would have to fly somewhere to do a case or a conference or whatever, then I would fly at that time. But being a New Orleans girl, I was told by my Italian father that I was welcome to go to Chicago and work, but I was leaving the 4 grandchildren behind, right? So we worked it out. We've been working remotely now for 22 years. But the thing that really, that I appreciate most about Nick, who is my friend and my brother in arms, is that he said this. At the time, I had 4 little children. They were ages 1 to 8 or 9. Now they're in their 20s. But he said, look, if there's a kindergarten play and there's a hearing, there's going to be only one kindergarten play. So go to the kindergarten play, okay? Tell me about it, and I'll get somebody else to take the hearing, or I'll take the hearing. But if we're going to build a culture of life, we have to start in our own families. And so Nick, you know, this is 22 years ago, where women were still trying to figure out our place in the work field, taught me how to be unapologetic in putting my family first, right? And so I invite all of you men who are employers to do the same thing for your women employees. Give them permission to put their family first, because guess what? We can do things 24/7 around the clock. While y'all are sleeping, you have no idea what us women are doing, right? It doesn't have to be between 9 to 5. So I thank you all for having us here tonight. I thank Nick for bringing me along this journey, that as we build a culture of life together, we do so in our families, and that we do so as we encourage each other. Thank you very much.